White opens with establishing central control and a solid pawn structure. The evaluation remains balanced. Black mirrors White's central push with maintaining the dynamic balance and a symmetrical setup. White challenges the center with aiming to undermine Black's pawn structure. A typical Queen's Gambit idea. Black reinforces the center with creating a solid pawn triangle and preparing for piece development. White develops a knight to a natural square supporting the pawn and eyeing central influence. Black develops the bishop to preparing for castling and solidifying the kingside defense. White develops the kingside knight to a standard developing move contributing to central control. Black mirrors development with contesting the center and preparing for king safety. White pins the knight with a tactical idea to disrupt Black's coordination and potentially exploit the pin. Black castles kingside, prioritizing king safety and preparing to connect the rooks. A solid defensive measure. White activates the rook to targeting the semi-open c-file and applying pressure along it. Black challenges the pin with questioning White's bishop and preventing further tactical ideas like White retreats the bishop to maintaining the pressure and avoiding exchanges while keeping options open. Black plays, preparing to fianchetto the queen's bishop to control the long diagonal. White exchanges pawns on, simplifying the pawn structure in the center and opening lines. Black recaptures with the knight, developing a piece and centralizing the knight. White exchanges knights on, reducing Black's central influence and simplifying the position. Black recaptures with the pawn, opening the e-file and solidifying central control. White exchanges bishops on, simplifying the position and preparing for queen development. Black recaptures with the queen, activating the queen and centralizing her presence. White advances, a prophylactic move to prepare the fianchetto of the kingside bishop. The move the rook to e8 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to e6, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the knight to e5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to c5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the d-file takes on c5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Unlocking the rook to c8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to g2, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the bishop to g2 by White is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to e3, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to c5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to g2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to c6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking short castles with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to e6, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black develops the bishop to pinning the knight and creating tactical threats on the queenside. White solidifies the center with creating a stable pawn structure and opening lines for the queen. Black pushes, challenging White's central pawn structure and seeking counterplay. White targets the queenside with creating threats and putting pressure on Black's setup. Black activates the rook to contesting the c-file and reinforcing queenside activity. White centralizes the knight to a strong outpost offering excellent activity and control. Black centralizes the queen to contesting the center and improving its position. White moves the rook to rerouting it for potential action on the kingside or reinforcement. The move the rook to d8 by Black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn on the c-file takes on d4, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the rook takes on c8 with check executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the queen takes on c8, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the bishop takes on d5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Allowing the queen to c1 with check, forcing the enemy king to find safety. This allows the queen to d1, guaranteeing long-term space control. White advances, preparing to expand on the kingside and create attacking chances. The move the queen to d6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to d6, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the pawn to f4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to b5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to d1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to c4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to g4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White plays a prophylactic move to secure the queenside pawn structure and prepare. Black retreats the queen to a passive square lacking effective influence on the game. White advances, aggressively expanding kingside space and preparing to open lines. Black develops the bishop to, activating it on the long diagonal and improving piece coordination. White castles kingside, securing the king and connecting the remaining pieces for future action. The move the knight to a6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to a5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the rook on the f-file to c1, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to a6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to c2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to c7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to b4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White doubles rooks on the c-file, concentrating forces for a decisive push. Black moves the knight to a defensive maneuver that doesn't address White's positional dominance. White advances, aggressively expanding on the queenside and opening lines for attack. The move the pawn to c4 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to b5, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the rook takes on c5 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the pawn on the b-file takes on a4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the rook takes on c7, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the queen to e6 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the rook takes on b7, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White captures the pawn, taking advantage of the material gain and opening lines. Black recaptures, regaining a pawn but leaving their position severely weakened. White captures the pawn, winning another pawn and further enhancing the positional advantage. The move the rook on the f-file to b8 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the pawn to b5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the queen to a5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to d6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to a4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to a6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to c6, guaranteeing long-term space control. White centralizes the knight to, dominating key squares and threatening further incursions. The move the queen to e8 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the queen to e6, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Afterwards, the queen takes on a7, executes a favorable trade, which enables the knight to b5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to a6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to d6 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the knight takes on d8, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White captures the pawn, winning material and initiating a decisive assault. The move the pawn to b5 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to b5, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Afterwards, the queen takes on b6, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the knight takes on a3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the knight takes on d8, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the queen takes on d8, executes a favorable trade. This allows the queen to a6, guaranteeing long-term space control. White exchanges the knight for the pawn, converting the material advantage into a winning endgame. Black recaptures with the rook but is hopelessly lost due to the overwhelming material deficit. White places the bishop on a dominant outpost, controlling crucial squares and sealing the victory.